The morning sun cast long shadows across the rolling plains when Sarah first spotted the lone figure approaching through the tall grass. She had been hanging laundry behind the modest ranch house when movement caught her eye near the creek that bordered their property. At first, she thought it might be a deer or elk, but as the figure drew closer, she could see it was a young woman walking with careful, measured steps. Sarah called to her husband Thomas, who was mending a fence post near the barn. He looked up, shading his eyes with his weathered hand as he followed her gaze. The woman appeared to be Native American, likely Lakota given their location in the Dakota Territory. Her long black hair hung loose around her shoulders, and she wore traditional dress that had seen better days. Even from a distance, they could see she was exhausted. Thomas set down his tools and walked slowly toward the approaching figure, Sarah following a few steps behind. They had heard rumors of trouble brewing between the cavalry and various tribes, but their remote ranch had remained largely untouched by the conflicts that plagued other settlements. Thomas believed in treating all people with respect, regardless of their background, though he knew not all their neighbors shared this view. As the young woman came within speaking distance, they could see she was perhaps 17 or 18 years old. Her dark eyes held a wariness born of recent hardship, and her clothes showed signs of travel through rough country. She moved with the grace common to her people, but there was an urgency in her posture that suggested she was fleeing from something. She stopped about 20 feet from them and spoke in careful English, her voice soft but clear despite the tremor of fear that ran through it. "May I remain here until the raiders pass?" The simple question carried weight that both Thomas and Sarah immediately understood. Raiders meant soldiers, and soldiers meant danger for any Native American caught away from designated areas. Thomas studied her face for a moment, seeing the quiet dignity there despite her obvious distress. He had served briefly in the territorial militia years ago and knew the harsh realities of frontier justice. A young Lakota woman traveling alone would face terrible dangers if caught by the wrong group of men, whether they wore uniforms or not. Without hesitation, he gave a simple nod. "You can stay," he said quietly. "Sarah, get her some water and something to eat." The relief that washed over the girl's face was immediate and profound. She had clearly been prepared for rejection, possibly violence. Instead, she found unexpected kindness from strangers who owed her nothing. Sarah hurried inside to prepare food while Thomas gestured for the young woman to follow him to the shade of the covered porch. "What's your name?" Thomas asked gently as they settled onto simple wooden chairs. She replied, "It means eternal blossom in my language." She paused, then added, "I have been traveling for 3 days. My village, there was trouble." Thomas nodded, not pressing for details he suspected would be painful to share. Sarah returned with a cup of cool water and a plate of cornbread with honey, accepted both gratefully, though she ate with careful manners despite her obvious hunger. As the afternoon wore on, more of story emerged in quiet conversations. Her band had been camped along the Cheyenne River when cavalry scouts arrived with orders for them to report to the reservation immediately. Her father, a respected elder named Standing Bear, had argued that they were harming no one and had always maintained peaceful relations with nearby settlements. The commanding officer had given them 2 days to pack their belongings and begin the journey to the reservation. But during the night, young warriors from a neighboring band had raided a supply train, killing 2 soldiers. When dawn came, the cavalry returned with reinforcements and blood in their eyes. They made no distinction between peaceful families and the warriors who had committed the raid. His voice grew quiet as she described the chaos that followed. Families scattered in every direction as soldiers swept through the camp. She had last seen her parents helping elderly relatives onto horses before disappearing into the confusion of dust and shouting voices. A cousin had grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the river, where they hid among the cattails until the sounds of conflict faded. They had traveled together for the first day, but her cousin had family on the reservation and felt safer heading there directly. However, had heard too many stories of the conditions on reservations. Overcrowding, insufficient food, and the constant surveillance of Indian agents created a different kind of prison. She had decided to head south, hopping to find relatives among the bands that still roamed freely in more remote areas. Thomas and Sarah listened without judgment, understanding that they were hearing about events that newspapers would likely report very differently, if at all. The official version would probably mention the raid on the supply train and the successful relocation of hostile Indians to their proper place. The human cost would be omitted entirely. As evening approached, Sarah prepared a proper meal while Thomas showed where she could wash in the creek. The simple kindness of clean water and soap brought tears to her eyes. For 3 days she had been running, sleeping rough, and living on berries and stream water. The normalcy of sitting at a table with plates and utensils felt like returning to civilization after a long journey through wilderness. During dinner, they learned more about each other. Thomas and Sarah had been farming this land for 7 years, having claimed it under the Homestead Act. They had no children of their own, though Sarah's sister had died, leaving 2 young boys who now lived with relatives back in Ohio. The loneliness of frontier life had taught them to value human connection wherever it could be found. Shared stories of her childhood, learning traditional skills from her grandmother while also attending the mission school where she had learned to read and write English. She spoke of seasonal hunts, ceremonial gatherings, and the intricate relationships between different bands that outsiders never understood. Her education bridged 2 worlds, though recent events had shown her how precarious that bridge really was. As darkness fell, Sarah prepared a bed for their guest in the small room they had hoped would someday be a nursery. Protested that she could sleep outside, not wanting to impose further on their hospitality. But Thomas firmly insisted she stay indoors where she would be safe and comfortable. Before retiring, Thomas checked the doors and windows more carefully than usual. While he trusted completely, her presence reminded him that their isolated location could be both blessing and curse. If soldiers came looking for escaped Indians, or if hostile neighbors decided to take matters into their own hands, the remote ranch that usually felt peaceful might become dangerously exposed. Sarah gave a clean nightgown and showed her where to find anything she might need during the night. As she prepared for bed, felt a complex mix of gratitude and guilt. These kind people were risking their own safety by sheltering her, yet she had nowhere else to turn. The uncertainty of her family's fate weighed heavily on her mind, but exhaustion finally overcame worry as she fell into the first peaceful sleep she had known in days. Outside, Thomas sat on the porch for a while, smoking his pipe and listening to the night sounds of the prairie. Somewhere out there, other families might be running through darkness, fleeing the same chaos that had brought to their door. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, at least, one young woman would sleep safely under their roof. Dawn brought the sound of approaching horses, their hoofbeats carrying across the still morning air like distant thunder. Thomas was already awake, having slept lightly with one ear tuned to any unusual sounds. He moved quickly but quietly to the window, peering through the curtains at the group of riders cresting the low hill to the east. 6 men in cavalry uniforms, riding in loose formation with the confident bearing of those accustomed to authority. Behind them rode 2 civilians, likely local men pressed into service as guides. Thomas felt his stomach tighten as he recognized one of them as Jake, a neighboring rancher known for his harsh views on Indians and his tendency to see hostility where none existed. Thomas woke Sarah with a gentle touch, putting his finger to his lips for silence before whispering what he had seen. Sarah's face went pale as she glanced toward the door of the room where slept. Without words, they both understood the gravity of the situation. Harboring a fugitive Indian, even a harmless young woman, could bring serious consequences ranging from legal troubles to vigilante justice. Moving carefully to avoid creaking floorboards, Thomas approached the room and tapped softly on the door frame. She was already awake, her keen hearing having caught the sound of the horses. Her eyes met his with complete understanding of what the approaching riders likely meant for her. "The root cellar," Sarah whispered urgently. "Under the kitchen floor, it's cool and dark, and they'll never think to look there." Nodded silently, gathering the few belongings she had carried with her. Sarah quickly pulled up the wooden trapdoor hidden beneath a large rug, revealing a small underground storage space where they kept vegetables and preserved foods through the winter. It would be cramped and uncomfortable, but it offered complete concealment. As descended into the cellar, Thomas replaced the trapdoor, and Sarah arranged the rug to look undisturbed. They had perhaps 2 minutes to prepare before the riders reached their door. Sarah quickly set the coffee pot on the stove and began preparing breakfast, trying to establish the appearance of a normal morning routine. Thomas stepped onto the porch just as the cavalry patrol rode into the yard, dust swirling around their horses' hooves. The commanding officer, a lieutenant by his insignia, was a young man with stern features and the rigid posture of someone trying to prove himself worthy of his rank. He dismounted and approached the porch with military precision. "Lieutenant William Hayes, 3rd Cavalry," he announced formally. We're conducting a search for escaped hostiles who fled during a lawful relocation operation. Have you seen any Indians in this area? Thomas adopted the casual manner of a simple farmer dealing with official business. Morning, Lieutenant. Can't say that I have. Pretty quiet out here most days. What kind of trouble are you dealing with? Jake spurred his horse closer to the porch, his weathered face showing the suspicious nature that had made him unpopular among more reasonable neighbors. Tom, you need to understand how serious this is. These aren't peaceful Indians. They're dangerous fugitives who might do anything to avoid being taken back to the reservation. The lieutenant shot an annoyed look, clearly preferring to conduct his own interrogation. We have reports that a young woman was seen heading in this general direction 3 days ago. She would be traveling alone, probably on foot. Native dress, long dark hair. Sarah appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron with studied casualness. Oh my, that does sound concerning. We haven't seen anyone like that, have we, Thomas? Though I did think I heard something near the creek yesterday evening. Could have been a deer, but now that you mention it. Her innocent suggestion was perfectly calculated to send the search in the wrong direction. The lieutenant nodded, making notes in a small leather book. We'll check the creek area. If you do see anything suspicious, you should report it immediately to the nearest military post. One of the soldiers had been examining the ground around the house, looking for tracks or other signs of recent visitors. Thomas felt his heart rate increase as the man approached the porch, but the hard-packed earth around their home showed only the usual traces of daily farm life. Wasn't satisfied with the brief conversation. Mind if we look around, just to be thorough? These Indians can be crafty, and you folks might not even know if someone was hiding nearby. Thomas felt a surge of anger at the man's presumptuous attitude, but he forced himself to remain calm. Of course, though I'm not sure what you expect to find. Sarah and I would certainly know if someone was staying on our property. The lieutenant seemed uncomfortable with this aggressive approach, but felt obliged to support the search. Just a quick look around the buildings, if you don't mind. Standard procedure. For the next 20 minutes, Thomas and Sarah watched nervously as soldiers searched their barn, chicken coop, and the small shed where they stored tools. Seemed particularly determined to find something, poking into every corner and shadow with unnecessary thoroughness. At one point, he entered the house itself, claiming to check for signs of forced entry or disturbance. Sarah followed him closely, ostensibly being helpful while actually ensuring he didn't linger in any one area too long. When he approached the kitchen, she kept up a steady stream of chatter about her breakfast preparations, managing to maneuver him away from the area above the root cellar without seeming to do so deliberately. Below ground remained perfectly still despite the cramped conditions and stifling air. She could hear Boots walking overhead and's gruff voice questioning everything he saw. The terror of discovery mixed with gratitude for the courage her hosts were showing in protecting her. She knew that if found, they would all face serious consequences. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, emerged from the house looking frustrated and defeated. Nothing obvious, he reported to the lieutenant, though his tone suggested he remained suspicious. The lieutenant nodded and addressed Thomas directly. We appreciate your cooperation, mister. Remember, these fugitives are considered dangerous. If you see anything at all, send word immediately to Fort McKinney. As the patrol prepared to leave, lingered behind for a moment. Tom, I've known you for 3 years and you've always been a straight shooter, but I want you to think carefully about the situation we're dealing with. These aren't civilized people we're talking about. They're savages who would slit your throat as soon as look at you if they thought it would help them escape. Thomas met's eyes steadily. I appreciate your concern, Jake, but Sarah and I can take care of ourselves. If there was any real danger around here, we'd be the first to know about it. Seemed about to say more, but the lieutenant was already mounting his horse and calling for the patrol to move out. With obvious reluctance, rejoined the group as they rode away toward the creek, following Sarah's misdirection. Thomas and Sarah waited until the riders were completely out of sight before hurrying back into the house. Sarah pulled up the trapdoor while Thomas helped climb out of the cramped cellar. She was pale and shaking, both from the physical discomfort of her hiding place and the emotional strain of hearing herself described as a dangerous savage. Are you hurt? Sarah asked anxiously, nodding how stiffly moved as she straightened up. I am unharmed, replied quietly. But I heard what that man said about my people. He truly believes we are all monsters. Thomas felt a surge of protective anger. Jake's a fool who sees enemies everywhere he looks. Don't let his ignorance define how you think all white people see you. The close call had shaken all of them, but it had also revealed something important. The search was organized and thorough, which meant couldn't simply wait a day or two for things to quiet down. The cavalry would continue patrolling the area, and suspicions might bring more unwelcome attention to the ranch. Over breakfast, they discussed options with new urgency. Staying at the ranch was becoming increasingly dangerous for everyone involved. Yet sending her back out alone seemed equally risky, especially now that organized patrols were actively searching the countryside. Thomas proposed a solution that surprised both women. His brother-in-law operated a trading post 2 days' ride south, near the town of Cedar Falls. The man had always been sympathetic to Indian concerns and had Lakota friends among the traders who frequented his establishment. More importantly, Cedar Falls was far enough from the current search area that might be able to blend in more easily. "But how would I get there safely?" asked. "The soldiers will be watching all the roads." Thomas had been thinking about that problem as well. "Sarah's old riding dress might fit you, and we could fix your hair differently. From a distance, you'd look like any white woman traveling with her family." The plan was risky, but it offered hope. Sarah immediately began gathering suitable clothes while Thomas planned a route that would avoid main roads and likely patrol areas. They would leave early the next morning, traveling as a family group going to visit relatives in Cedar Falls. As they prepared for the journey, struggled with mixed emotions. The kindness these strangers had shown her restored some faith in human goodness, but the hatred in its voice reminded her how precarious her situation truly was. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, but tonight she was safe, surrounded by people who saw her as a human being rather than a problem to be solved. The transformation was remarkable. Sarah had worked through the evening altering her old blue traveling dress to fit slender frame, while Thomas prepared the wagon and selected their most reliable horses. As dawn broke over the prairie, the young Lakota woman stood before them looking like any pioneer daughter preparing for a family journey. Sarah had braided long black hair and pinned it up in the style worn by white women of the territory. A simple bonnet completed the disguise while also providing some concealment for her distinctive features. The change in appearance was so complete that Thomas found himself doing a double take when he first saw her. "Remember," Sarah instructed gently as they loaded supplies into the wagon, "if anyone asks, you're my cousin Mary from Ohio, and we're going to visit my brother-in-law's trading post. You've been helping me on the ranch while recovering from a fever." The story would explain any unusual behavior or reluctance to speak with strangers. Nodded, practicing the careful pronunciation and slightly different accent Sarah had taught her. Her English was already excellent, but certain words carried the distinctive rhythm of her native language that might give her away to observant listeners. Thomas drove the wagon while Sarah and sat on the wooden bench beside him, maintaining the appearance of a normal family outing. They had planned their route carefully, avoiding the main roads where military patrols were most likely to be found. Instead, they followed cattle trails and lesser-known paths that meandered through rolling hills and sparse woodlands. The first few hours passed without incident. They encountered only a single homesteader driving his own wagon in the opposite direction, and he barely looked up from his horses long enough to nod a greeting. Began to relax slightly, though she remained alert to every sound and movement around them. Near midday, they stopped to rest the horses and eat the lunch Sarah had packed. Sitting in the shade of a grove of cottonwoods beside a small creek, they could almost pretend this was simply a pleasant family excursion. Helped Sarah spread their blanket while Thomas watered the horses, and for a few minutes the tension of their dangerous journey faded. "Tell me about your brother-in-law," asked as they shared bread and cold meat. "Can he truly be trusted to help me?" Sarah smiled warmly. "Daniel is a good man who judges people by their character rather than their appearance. He's traded with Lakota bands for years and speaks your language better than most white men. If anyone can help you find safe passage to your relatives, it would be him." Thomas nodded agreement. Daniel never had much use for the Army's methods. He believes commerce builds better relationships than force ever could. His trading post is neutral ground where everyone is welcome as long as they come in peace. As they prepared to continue their journey, the sound of approaching riders sent them scrambling to pack up their belongings and assume their roles. A group of 4 men on horseback emerged from the trees, and Thomas immediately recognized trouble. These weren't soldiers but local ranchers, including Jake and 3 others known for their hostile views toward Indians. His eyes swept over their little group with obvious suspicion. "Well, Tom, fancy meeting you out here, taking a family trip." Thomas kept his voice casual while positioning himself slightly between the riders and the women. "Heading down to Cedar Falls to visit Sarah's brother-in-law. Been meaning to make the trip for months." One of his companions, a heavyset man named Briggs, urged his horse closer to the wagon. "Heard there's been more Indian trouble in the area. We're doing our own patrol since the Army boys seem to be having such a hard time catching these savages." Kept her head down, pretending to fuss with the lunch basket while her heart hammered in her chest. Sarah moved closer to her, creating a natural family grouping that helped shield from close observation. His attention focused on with uncomfortable intensity. "Don't believe I've met your companion, Sarah, family member." Sarah's voice remained perfectly steady. "My cousin Mary from Ohio. She's been staying with us while recovering from a fever. The doctor thought the trip might do her some good." Briggs leaned forward in his saddle, trying to get a better look at his face. "Awful dark complexion for someone from Ohio. Looks like she might have some Indian blood to me." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Thomas felt his muscles tense as he prepared for whatever might come next. Sarah moved protectively closer to while maintaining her innocent demeanor. "Really, Mr. Briggs," Sarah said with just the right touch of indignation. "Mary's complexion is perfectly normal for someone who's been working outdoors. Perhaps you should spend more time in the sun yourself instead of seeing Indians behind every bush." Wasn't satisfied. "Mind if we take a closer look, just to be sure? These Indians can be mighty clever about disguising themselves." Thomas stepped forward, his patience finally wearing thin. "Jake, you're way out of line here. This is my family, and I don't appreciate you questioning my wife's word or frightening her cousin." The confrontation might have escalated dangerously, but at that moment, another group of riders appeared on the trail behind them. This time it was a genuine cavalry patrol, led by a grizzled sergeant who clearly outranked the civilian group in authority, if not social standing. Sergeant Mills had been dealing with frontier tensions for over a decade and had little patience for amateur Indian hunters who might interfere with official operations. "What's the situation here?" Eagerly explained his suspicions, but the sergeant's experienced eye quickly assessed the peaceful family scene and dismissed the concerns with professional authority. "Mister, I appreciate your vigilance, but this is obviously a rancher and his family on a legitimate journey. I suggest you leave law enforcement to those who are trained for it." The sergeant's intervention provided exactly the authority needed to defuse the situation, and his companions had no choice but to accept the military judgment, though their departure was marked by muttered complaints and suspicious backward glances. After both groups had ridden away in different directions, Thomas, Sarah, and remained motionless for several minutes, hardly daring to believe they had escaped detection. The close call had revealed just how precarious situation truly was, even with her careful disguise. "We can't take the main trail to Cedar Falls," Thomas said finally. "Too many people are watching for anything unusual." They spent the rest of the afternoon following a much more circuitous route through broken country where they were unlikely to encounter other travelers. The path was rougher and slower, but it offered precious anonymity. Proved herself an invaluable traveling companion, often spotting potential problems before Thomas or Sarah noticed them. As evening approached, they made camp in a secluded valley where a spring provided fresh water and scattered trees offered shelter. Thomas built a small, nearly smokeless fire while Sarah prepared a simple supper. Helped with the camp tasks, her movements efficient and graceful despite the strain of the long day. Over their evening meal, they discussed the remaining challenges. Cedar Falls was still a full day's travel away, and tomorrow would bring fresh risks of discovery. However, they were now far enough from the original search area that patrols would be less frequent. "Once we reach Daniel's trading post," Sarah explained, "you'll have choices about what to do next. He knows safe routes south and has contacts among traders who travel to areas where your people still live freely." Nodded thoughtfully. "I have been thinking about what you said earlier about judging people by their character. You and Thomas have shown me that not all white people see my kind as enemies. This gives me hope that understanding between our peoples might someday be possible." Thomas poked at the fire with a stick, his expression serious. There are good and bad people in every group. The trick is telling them apart before it's too late. As they prepared for sleep, insisted on taking the first watch despite Thomas's protests. She had grown up in a world where vigilance was a survival skill, and her keen senses might detect dangers that others would miss. Sitting beside the dying fire with a rifle across her knees, she reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. 3 days ago, she had been a terrified refugee fleeing through unfamiliar territory with no hope except distance from her pursuers. Now she traveled with people who had risked their own safety to protect her, learning that kindness could be found in the most unexpected places. The morning would bring them to Cedar Falls and the next phase of her uncertain journey. But tonight, under a canopy of stars that shone the same on Lakota camps and white homesteads alike, she felt something she had almost forgotten, the possibility that her story might have a hopeful ending. When dawn came, they broke camp quickly and continued toward their destination with renewed determination. By afternoon, the scattered buildings of Cedar Falls appeared in the distance, marking the end of one chapter of adventure and the beginning of whatever would come next. The young woman who had arrived at a remote ranch asking for temporary shelter was about to discover that sometimes the kindness of strangers could change the entire course of a life.